President Biden is set to address the nation in just about 90 minutes. The recent unprovoked Russian attacks on neighboring Ukraine will likely change tonight's speech from what had been planned just a few weeks ago. John Dickerson joins me now. He is CBS News senior national correspondent and chief political analyst. So, John, the president campaigned on restoring the soul of the nation. What kind of progress has he made on that?
Well, first we have to decide what we mean by restoring the soul of the nation. I mean, essentially what candidate Biden meant when he said that was, I'm going to not be Donald Trump. And so in that regard, he has restored, he's repaired the soul of the nation. He doesn't use bullying as a tactic. He doesn't assault and insult the other side. He believes in bipartisanship and putting in the work that's responsible and that's a part of that. He has just lowered the boil on the presidency. He's not in the public consciousness as much, and he doesn't use grievance to make his case. He also, with respect to Ukraine, he believes in, and we've seen since the beginning of his presidency, he believes in alliances. He believes in treating traditional friends of the United States with respect and, in some cases, deference. And when he makes a mistake, as he did in the relationships between France and Australia, he tries to make amends. That is all thematically different, and that would go under the heading of restoring the soul. But, of course, there's a large portion of the country, some of whom believe, along with Donald Trump, incorrectly, that the election was stolen, where they think that he's damaging the soul of America. So the way they see things, when the president talks about voting rights, they see that as an act of grievance. So there's only so much repair you can do with the soul of America, given the structure of our partisan politics right now. All
right, very quick correction. I think I said 90 minutes. I misspoke. It's about 2.5 hours or so that we're expecting. Math is not my forte, clearly, John. Let me ask you about the events in Ukraine, though, John, serve as this reminder of how unforeseen events can really eclipse any president's best laid plans. How is Russia's attack on Ukraine forcing a change in course for the president?
The presidency is a job that's full of surprises, and that's true of the State of the Union as well. In 1980, Jimmy Carter devoted most of his speech to the surprise Russian invasion of Afghanistan. In 1913, when Woodrow Wilson returned to the tradition of speaking and giving the address in public, he said in that speech, well, the world is reaching a new level of peace. In about 6 months, you had the First World War. So the presidency is a job of surprises. And when you look at the Biden presidency, it's not just a surprise that has taken over his efforts to focus on the domestic economy and fighting COVID, but even on the foreign policy front, President Biden, though he has talked about autocrats, he has really focused a lot of his foreign policy first on Afghanistan and then on China. So Ukraine is a distraction natural to the job, but a distraction not only from domestic affairs, but even from what he had hoped to be his foreign policy agenda.
It's interesting in this political environment. After this State of the Union address, John, as you know, there are some 5 planned responses. How does that illustrate the challenges the president faces in getting his agenda passed?
Many of those responses are from Democrats. Will Rogers said, I'm not a member of an organized party, I'm a Democrat. And so that would be in keeping with that tradition. However, when you look at the Democratic Party and the agitations within it, these responses are interesting because you have sort of moderate Democrats calling out progressives like Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who's giving one of the responses, saying you should be unified with the president. Well, there's nothing that is not necessarily out of unison with the president. In fact, Congresswoman Tlaib could, in fact, do a lot of work that would help the president. In a speech like tonight, the president is going to be standing there as the leader of the free world in response to Russia. He can't act too overtly politically, but a member of Congress certainly could. And so, in fact, these other speeches could help the president's case as he thinks about the election. Now, on the other hand, they could also thoroughly undermine it by taking attention away from what he's doing. But it's not necessarily the case that this undermines the president. The fact, though, that moderates are speaking out against some of these other speeches tells us also something about the situation they're in, which means as a moderate Democrat trying to hold on to your seat in a competitive district, sometimes you have to act and use members of your own party as a foil. You have to say, I'm not one of them. Well, Well, if that's the condition of politics in the Democratic Party right now, it's going to be a lot of messiness between now and December, and that doesn't bode well for Democrats trying to keep their seats.
Yeah, it's a reminder of all of the different audiences that these elected officials, including President Biden, are trying to connect with. So President Biden's inaugural address was an open plea to restore bipartisanship and collaboration in Washington.
We can see each other not as adversaries, but as neighbors. We can treat each other with dignity and respect. We can join forces, stop the shouting, and lower the temperature. For without unity, there is no peace, only bitterness and fury. No progress, only exhausting outrage. No nation, only a state of chaos. This is our historic moment of crisis and challenge, and unity is the path forward.
Unity, John. Has the president delivered on that?
Well, it takes two at least to tango, so it's not just the president's job to bring unity. I think there are a couple of different ways you can measure this. Certainly, relative to the rancor that initiated January 6th and the attack on the Capitol, where the president, from which he gave that speech, the country is less agitated than it was then. Of course, you have the leader of the Republican Party and likely nominee of the Republican Party in 2024, Donald Trump, continuing to agitate, continuing to lie that the last election was stolen. So you have a kind of low-grade agitation going on. But if you look at what's happened in Congress, President Biden passed a relief for COVID. He passed a bipartisan bill on infrastructure. He passed a bipartisan bill to increase American competitiveness against China. There's been defense spending that has been agreed to by both parties. There's actually been a fair amount of legislation that's been agreed to by both parties. Now, that isn't to say that there isn't a lot of the ugly partisanship, particularly among some of the members who see a way to increase their personal fortunes by acting out. But you're going to have that in any instance where you have margins that are so thin. Control of the Senate and the House is within grasp for Republicans, and so there is no structural incentive for them to work with a Democratic president. Even so, there have been some things that have been done, and so overall, the president has made inroads in terms of trying to lower the acrimony, but we still have it written into the structure of American politics.
All right, John Dickerson. John, we always appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine.